Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. I believe we have about 2 chapters left, if I'm correct. We are beginning chapter 13, which is entitled Of the Coming of John. What bring they neath the midnight beside the river sea? They bring the human heart wherein no nightly calm can be. That droppeth never with the wind, nor drieth with the dew. O calm it, God, thy calm is broad, to cover spirits too. The river floweth on. Mrs. Browning. Carlisle Street runs westward from the center of Johnstontown across a great black bridge, down a hill and up again, by little shops and meat markets, past single-storied homes, until suddenly it stops against a wide green lawn. It is a broad, restful place, with 2 large buildings outlined against the west. When at evening the winds come swelling from the east, and the great pall of the city's smoke hangs wearily above the valley, then the red west glows like a dreamland down Carlisle Street, and, at the tolling of the supper bell, throws the passing forms of students in dark silhouette against the sky. Tall and black, they move slowly by, and seem in the sinister light to flit before the city like dim warning ghosts. Perhaps they are, for this is Wales Institute, and these black students have few dealings with the white city below. And if you will notice, night after night, there is one dark form that ever hurries last and late toward the twinkling lights of Swain Hall, for Jones is never on time. A long, straggling fellow he is, brown and hard-haired, who seems to be going straight out of his clothes and walks with a half-apologetic roll. He used perpetually to set the quiet dining room into waves of merriment as he stole to his place after the bell had tapped for prayers. He seemed so perfectly awkward, and yet one glance at his face made one forgive him much, that broad, good-natured smile in which lay no bit of art or artifice, but seemed just bubbling good nature and genuine satisfaction with the world. He came to us from Altamaha. Altamaha? Altamaha. I've never seen that city before. He came to us from Altamaha, away down there beneath the gnarled oaks of southeast Georgia, where the sea croons to the sands and the sands listen till they sink half drowned beneath the waters, rising only here and there in long, low islands. The white folks of Altamaha voted John a good boy, fine plowhand, good in the rice fields, handy everywhere, and always good-natured and respectful. But they shook their heads when his mother wanted to send him off to school. Quote, "It'll spoil him, ruin him," end quote, they said, and they talked as though they knew. But full half the black folk followed him proudly to the station and carried his queer little trunk in many bundles. And there they shook hands, and the girls kissed him shyly, and the boys clapped him on the back. So the train came, and he pinched his little sister lovingly, and put his great arms about his mother's neck, and then was away with a puff and a roar into the great yellow world that flamed and flared about the doubtful pilgrim. Up the coast they hurried, past the squares and palmettos of Savannah, through the cotton fields and through the weary night to Millville, and came with the morning to the noise and bustle of Johnstown. And they that stood behind, that morning in Altamaha, and watched the train as it noisily bore playmate and brother and son away to the world, had thereafter one ever reoccurring word, quote, "when John comes," end quote. Then what parties were to be, and what speakings in the churches, what new furniture in the front room, perhaps even a new front room, and there would be a new schoolhouse, with John as teacher, and then perhaps a big wedding, all this and more, when John comes. But the white people shook their heads. At first he was coming at Christmas time, but the vacation proved too short. And then the next summer, but times were hard and schooling costly, and so, instead, he worked in Johnstown. And so it drifted to the next summer, and the next, till playmates scattered, and mother grew gray, and sister went up to the judge's kitchen to work. And still the legend lingered, quote, when John comes, end quote. Up at the judges, they rather liked this refrain, for they too had a John, a fair-haired, smooth-faced boy who had played many a long summer's day to his close with his dark namesake. Quote, yes, sir. John is at Princeton, sir, end quote, said the broad-shouldered, gray-haired judge every morning as he marched down to the post office. Quote, showing the Yankees what a Southern gentleman can do, end quote, he added, and strode home again with his letters and papers. Up at the great pillared house, they lingered long over the Princeton letter. The judge and his frail wife, his sister and growing daughters. Quote, it'll make a man of him, end quote, said the judge. Quote, college is the place, end quote. And then he asked the shy little waitress, quote, well, Jenny, how's your John, end quote. And added reflectively, quote, too bad your mother sent him off. It will spoil him, end quote. And the waitress wondered. Thus, in the faraway southern village, the world lay waiting, half consciously, the coming of two young men, and dreamed in an inarticulate way of new things that would be done and new thoughts that all would think. And yet it was singular that few thought of two Johns, for the black folk thought of one John, and he was black, and the white folk thought of another John, and he was white. And neither world thought the other world's thought, save with a vague unrest. Up in Johnstown, at the Institute, we were long puzzled at the case of John Jones. For a long time, the clay seemed unfit for any sort of molding. He was loud and boisterous, always laughing and singing, and never able to work consecutively at anything. He did not know how to study. He had no idea of thoroughness, and with his tardiness, carelessness, and appalling good humor, we were sore perplexed. One night we sat in faculty meeting, worried and serious, for Jones was in trouble again. This last escapade was too much, and so we solemnly voted, quote, that Jones, on account of repeated disorder and inattention to work, be suspended for the rest of the term, end quote. It seemed to us that the first time life ever struck Jones as a really serious thing was when the dean told him he must leave school. He stared at the gray-haired man blankly, with great eyes. Quote, why? Why? End quote, he faltered. Quote, but I haven't graduated, end quote. Then the dean slowly and clearly explained, reminding him of the tardiness and the carelessness, of the poor lessons and neglected work, of the noise and disorder, until the fellow hung his head in confusion. Then he said quickly, quote, but you won't tell Mammy and sister. You won't write Mammy, now will you? For if you won't, I'll go out into the city and work and come back next term and show you something, end quote. So the dean promised faithfully, and John shouldered his little trunk, giving neither word nor a look to the giggling boys, and walked down Carlisle Street to the great city with sober eyes and a set and serious face. Perhaps we imagined it, but some way it seemed to us that the serious look that crept over his boyish face that afternoon never left again. When he came back to us, he went to work with all his rugged strength. It was a hard struggle, for things did not come easily to him. Few crowding memories of early life and teaching came to help him on his new way. But all the world toward which he strode was of his own building, and he builded slow and hard. As the light dawned lingeringly on his new creations, he sat rapt and silent before the vision, or wandered alone over the green campus, peering through and beyond the world of men into a world of thought. And the thoughts at times puzzled him sorely. He could not see just why the circle was not square, and carried it out 56 decimal places one midnight. Would have gone further, indeed, had not the matron rapped for lights out. He caught terrible colds lying on his back in the meadows of nights, trying to think out the solar system. He had grave doubts as to the ethics of the fall of Rome, and strongly suspected the Germans of being thieves and rascals, despite his textbooks. He pondered long over every new Greek word, and wondered why this meant that, and why it couldn't mean something else, and how it must have felt to think all these things in Greek. So he thought and puzzled along for himself, pausing perplexed where others skipped merrily, and walking steadily through the difficulties where the rest stopped and surrendered. Thus he grew in body and soul, and with him his clothes seemed to grow and arrange themselves. Coat sleeves got longer, cuffs appeared, and collars got less soiled. Now and then his boots shone, and a new dignity crept into his walk. And we who saw daily a new thoughtfulness growing in his eyes began to expect something of this plodding boy. Thus he passed out of preparatory school into college, and we who watched him felt 4 more years of change, which almost transformed the tall, grave man who bowed to us commencement morning. He had left his queer thought world and came back to a world of motion and of men. He looked now for the first time sharply about him and wondered he had seen so little before. He grew slowly to feel almost for the first time the veil that lay between him and the white world. He first noticed now the oppression that had not seemed oppression before, differences that erstwhile seemed natural, restraints and slights that in his boyhood days had gone unnoticed or been greeted with a laugh. He felt angry now when men did not call him, quote, Mr., end quote. He clenched his hands at the, quote, Jim Crow, end quote, cars, and chafed at the color line that hemmed him in and his. That hemmed in him and his, excuse me. A tinge of sarcasm crept into his speech and a vague bitterness into his life. And he sat long hours wondering and planning a way around these crooked things. Daily he found himself shrinking from the choked and narrow life of his native town. And yet he always planned to go back to Altima High, always planned to work there. Still, more and more as the day approached, he hesitated with a nameless dread. And even the day after graduation, he seized with eagerness the offer of the dean to send him north with the quartet during the summer vacation to sing for the Institute. With the quartet for the summer vacation to sing for the Institute. A breath of air before the plunge, he said to himself in half apology. Okay, I was trying to get to a place there where I felt that it was something pertinent that I could reflect upon. This is told more like a story than we've had different chapters in here that read like stories, and there is some type of philosophical meaning within them and some type of social commentary that can be pulled from within them. And then we've had other chapters that are completely just social commentary or political commentary. And this is the former. This is something that obviously is a story that's being written that has social commentary within it and has political commentary within it. But it has to be sort of, you have to have the perspective to be able to you have to be conscious of some of these issues to be able to see that perspective that is being put within there. And so what stood out to me first about this was how Du Bois spoke of John being said to be spoiled by going to school or by going to get educated. The white people in the town he was from warned the black people that it would spoil him, warned his mother, told his sister that him going out there would spoil him. And they said that because, as was illustrated at the very beginning, John was very innocent, naive. Also, it seems to be within there is innocent, naive, and it did seem that he was very conscious of some of the social issues that existed for him. And I think that is how it is for most young black people as you're growing up. Everybody has a different point in time in which they start to lose their naivete and lose their innocence and become conscious of the type of society that we exist in. And for John, it took him leaving the city he was from, going to school, and even getting kicked out of the school for a semester for him to really understand the reality of the society he was in, the reality of the situation he was in, the reality of the condition he was in as a black man, a young black man in the 20th century in this racist society. And I think one of the other things that stands out to me is how the hopes of all of this whole community was in John. The hopes of the whole black community in this area was within John. And that was and is continues to remain for black people a very unique experience that we have here where and when one black person makes it or does something, it feels as if all of us have made it or all of us have done something. And it may not be necessarily on a national level. We can speak just on a local level. That's something that we see being happening often. It's something that when we read the previous book we read, Sister Citizen, Melissa V. Harris Perry spoke about the pros and cons of that, the pros and cons of seeing yourself in, can't remember the term she used, but seeing yourself as a black man or a black woman uh, through the experiences of another black person. So when that black person triumphs, it feels as if you triumph. But when that black person deals with failure, it feels as if you deal with failure as well. And when that person is triumphant, black people are told that you should be more like that black person that's triumphant. And when a black person may fail, black people are told that you're just like all this is all that you can be expected to do, that this is what black people are, that they fail. And so this double-edged sword that exists for us as a people who have been routinely marginalized and routinely subjugated and oppressed and exploited. It's this double-edged sword where one of us making it empowers so many of us, but that can also in certain times be used against us because the masses of us not making it or even one of us or not making it can then also be turned and used as a weapon against the rest of us. And that's sort of what we see here, where they were very high and very encouraged and empowered when John first left. And they kept holding on to the idea of John coming back. But as they waited and waited, you see how much of their selves and their own identity is tied into the success of John and tied into the achievements of John and the education of John. And so I think that's a very unique and important aspect of this for us to remember. And she also do well. Let's say this: Melissa V. Harris Perry also speaks about the concept of the crooked room and people going inside of a crooked room or going inside a room where all the images and all the things within the room, the items in the room are crooked or tilted at an angle. And she spoke about how some people go into the room and they can make themselves straight even though everything else in the room is crooked. And then there's other people who go into the room and they, in an attempt to make themselves straight within the room, they make themselves crooked like everything else. And that sticks out to me because when John speaks about because when Du Bois speaks about the evolution of John, the growth of John, the development of John, he speaks about John noticing this crooked room that he was living in. John noticing these double standards, these hypocrisies that he had to exist in. And it was a lot easier for him to notice that, or it was a lot easier for him to deal with those things being naive and innocent and not conscious to him because they go unnoticed, because he goes unfazed by them. But what happens with black people once they lose that naivete, once they lose that innocence, once they gain that consciousness, is that you start to see all these different ways you're being discriminated against, all these different prejudices that exist, all these different stereotypes, all these different forms of exploitation, oppression, marginalization, subjugation, stigmatization that exist. And it once you have this education, this knowledge, this understanding of these things, it turns you bitter because you realize that how many things are being not just only withheld from you, but also withheld from your people. When he realized how much it took for you to get this understanding and you to get this education, and then you look and you see the things that your people are dealing with, it creates this anger or this bitterness or this uh and of course it manifests in different ways for different people. But when once you can understand what it is that is actually happening, once you realize that you are in a cage, that you are trapped, that people who look like you are in this cage are trapped and have this glass ceiling, it is something that is very difficult to grasp, and it is something that changes you very much. And I think that Du Bois did a great job in that last paragraph of just talking about how that change manifested on John. And then lastly, what stands out to me is the risk for black parents, for black communities that they had to take to get to for their children to be educated, to send them away when there's no telephones, no FaceTime, no cell phones, no emails, when you just got to rely on getting a letter back and forth. You don't know if this person is okay, just the extreme difficulties that it took for Black people to gain something that should be as accessible as education. It was a bright September afternoon, and the streets of New York were brilliant with moving men. They reminded John of the sea as he sat in the square and watched them, so changelessly changing, so bright and dark, so grave and gay. He scanned their rich and faultless clothes, the way they carried their hands, the shape of their hats. He peered into the hurrying carriages. Then, leaning back with a sigh, he said, quote, "This is the world," end quote. The notion suddenly seized him to see where the world was going, since many of the richer and brighter seemed hurrying all one way. So when a tall, light-haired young man and a little talkative lady came by, he rose half hesitatingly and followed them. Up the street they went, past stores and gay shops, across the broad square, until with 100 others they entered the high portal of a great building. He was pushed toward the ticket office with the others and felt in his pocket for the new $5 bill he had hoarded. There seemed really no time for hesitation, so he drew it bravely out, passed it to the busy clerk, and received simply a ticket, but no change. When at last he realized that he had paid $5 to enter, he knew not what, he stood stock still, amazed. Quote, "Be careful," end quote, said a low voice behind him, end quote. Oh, excuse me, let's try it again. Quote, "Be careful," end quote, said a low voice behind him. Quote, "You must not lynch the colored gentleman simply because he's in your way," end quote. And the girl looked up roguishly into the eyes of her fair-haired escort. A shade of annoyance passed over the escort's face. Quote, "You will not understand us at the South," end quote, he said half impatiently, as if continuing an argument. Quote, "With all your professions, one never sees in the North so cordial and intimate relations between white and blacks as are everyday occurrences with us. Why, I remember my closest playfellow in boyhood was a little Negro named after me, and surely no two," quote, "well," end quote, the man stopped short and flushed to the roots of his hair, for there directly beside his reserved orchestra chairs sat the Negro he had stumbled over in the hallway. He hesitated and grew pale with anger, called the usher and gave him his card, with a few peremptory words, and slowly sat down. The lady deftly changed the subject. All this John did not see, for he sat in a half maze, minding the scene about him. The delicate beauty of the hall, the faint perfume, the moving myriad of men, the rich clothing and low hum of talking seemed all a part of a world so different from his, so strangely more beautiful than anything he had known, that he sat in dreamland and started when, after a hush, rose high and clear the music of Lohengrin's Swan. The infinite beauty of the wail lingered and swept through every muscle of his frame and put it all atune. He closed his eyes and grasped the elbows of the chair, touching unwittingly the lady's arm, and the lady drew away. A deep longing swelled in all his heart to rise with that clear music out of the dirt and dust of that low life that held him prisoned and befouled. If he could only live up in the free air where birds sang and setting suns had no touch of blood. Who had called him to be the slave and butt of all? And if he had called, what right had he to call when a world like this lay open before men? Then the movement changed, and fuller, mightier harmony swelled away. He looked thoughtfully across the hall and wondered why the beautiful gray-haired woman looked so listless and what the little man could be whispering about. He would not like to be listless and idle, he thought, for he felt with the music the movement of power within him. If he but had some master work, some life service, hard, bitter hard, but without the cringing and sickening servility, without the cruel hurt that hardened his heart and soul. When at last the soft sorrow crept across the violins, there came to him the vision of a far-off home, the great eyes of his sister, and the dark drawn face of his mother, and his heart sank below the waters, even as the sea sand sinks by the shores of Altamaha. only to be lifted aloft again with that last ethereal wail of the swan that quivered and faded into the sky. It left John sitting so silent and rapt that he did not for some time notice the usher tapping him lightly on the shoulder and saying politely, quote, "Will you step this way, please, sir?" End quote. A little surprised, he arose quickly at the last tap and, turning to leave his seat, looked full into the face of the fair-haired young man. For the first time, the young man recognized his dark boyhood playmate, and John knew that it was the judge's son. The white John started, lifted his hand, and then froze into his chair. The black John smiled lightly, then grimly, and followed the usher down the aisle. The manager was sorry, very, very sorry, but he explained that some mistake had been made in selling the gentleman a seat already disposed of. He would refund the money, of course, and indeed felt the matter keenly, and so forth, and, before he had finished, John was gone, walking hurriedly across the square and down the broad streets, and as he passed the park, he buttoned his coat and said, quote, "John Jones, you're a natural-born fool," end quote. Then he went to his lodgings and wrote a letter and tore it up. He wrote another and threw it in the fire. Then he seized a scrap of paper and wrote, quote, "Dear mother and sister, I am coming. John," end quote. All right, we're going to end this episode here, and then we will return tomorrow to finish up this chapter. I feel like this is a good spot to end it at. And then we can come back tomorrow and we will figure out what befalls John when he returns back home. And I think my biggest takeaways from that last passage is just it was bittersweet to read about how this experience John had in the North, how it made him aware of how much he was missing out on simply because he was black. And simply because he was black in America at the time in which he was black in America. All right, so please share this whatever platform you're listening to it on. Remember that we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And we'll be back tomorrow. Holla at you then.